I'm not sure how much longer I can hold on, the man murmured, blood dripping from his makeshift bandage, his eyes dazed with shock. You've torn an artery! I'll get you into surgery right away, Rachel Monroe shouted, until another voice cut in. Rachel, the patient must be registered first. In that moment, Rachel stood between two choices, saving a life or keeping the job she'd devoted over 10 years to. She chose the first, and just hours later, that single decision would send shockwaves through the entire hospital. What happened next? Why did one nurse's lone act lead to the hospital lobby being surrounded by dozens of Marines in uniform? The answer lies in the next chapter of this story. Rachel Monroe, at 35, had become a familiar face in the emergency department of St. Mary's Memorial. 12 years passed in the blink of an eye, yet every frantic rescue remained etched in her mind as if it were only yesterday. Rachel didn't choose medicine as a way to earn a living. For her, it was a mission passed down in her blood, from her father, a Marine returned from Iraq bearing wounds invisible to the eye. She grew up on his tales of courage, life, and death, and she understood. People need saving, not paperwork. But the hospital had changed. A new policy, cold and definitive, mandated that, unless a patient was in cardiac arrest, all treatment must be delayed until insurance paperwork was complete. Rachel knew the reasons behind it: finance, liability, procedure. But each time she stood before a patient in agony, begging for help, she felt as though she betrayed everything she believed. She began to harbor a quiet rage, a gnawing torment at having to choose between policy and conscience. That night, during a late, weary shift, the ER buzzed with footsteps, machines, and cries for help, often muffled and unclear. Rachel was used to that rhythm. But then the door burst open, and a figure stumbled in, shirt crumpled, dark with blood. His left arm was crudely bound by a jacket, the wound beneath it oozing in a dire plea no one could ignore. The man, later identified as Gregory Hale, looked as if he had summoned every last ounce of strength merely to reach this place. His face was ashen from blood loss, his gaze frantic. When he rasped out that he couldn't wait any longer, then collapsed before triage, the world seemed to pause. In Rachel's mind, there was no time for hesitation. It was a reflex, the instinct of someone who had seen too many lives slip away when help arrived too late. Yet another wave surged within her, fear, not of blood or illness, but fear that the system would punish her for doing what was right. Everything happened both in a flash and in slow motion. She glanced at the monitor, Gregory's blood pressure plummeting. She saw a colleague hesitating behind her, awaiting managerial approval. And she knew, unless she acted, this man would die, on the threshold of a hospital meant to save him. In a moment that defied protocol, Rachel crossed the desk and knelt beside Gregory. Her hands, steady from countless procedures, trembled with urgency. She called for help and ordered Trauma Room 2 prepped. Without waiting for anyone's blessing, she and another staff member lifted him onto a stretcher and rushed him down the corridor. The hallway stretched longer than ever. Footsteps pounded in her ears like battle drums. She caught a supervisor's voice calling behind her, but she did not stop. Could not. When they laid Gregory on the trauma table, Rachel felt blood soak her gloves. The wound was deep, slicing into the artery. Time seeped away like water through clenched fingers. Rachel moved with absolute focus. She dressed the wound, applied pressure, summoned the surgical team, and prepared IV fluids. Every motion was crisp, without complaint. She could feel life draining from the man before her, and with every skill she possessed, fought to hold him back. When the surgeons arrived, Rachel stayed, assisting, observing, noting every detail. She knew her actions were under scrutiny, but the only thought driving her was, if he lived, she could face anything else. That night, Rachel Monroe chose what was right, regardless of the risks to her own career. By the book, Rachel should have stopped Gregory Hale to complete his paperwork before any treatment began. But the instant she faced a man exsanguinating before her eyes, every line in her training manual, every protocol the hospital drilled into her, became meaningless. She did not see a patient. She saw a human teetering on the edge of life and death. And when her nursing instinct surged, fear, hesitation, or compliance were swept aside. She stepped forward. No permission, no waiting, no consultation. Her hands, which had performed hundreds of emergency procedures, moved with practiced urgency. One hand pressed over his left wound. The other tore gauze from the nearby crash cart and applied firm pressure. Blood soaked through almost instantly. Beneath the pad, his pulse fluttered, fading. Rachel spoke no word, yet her heart thundered in her chest like an alarm bell. She had watched too many lives slip away in those crucial minutes. She would not allow this man to die when she could still save him. Footsteps thundered behind her. The charge nurse stormed in, eyes cold, chart in hand, red pen poised to mark every violation. But Rachel did not look back. She was too busy battling the seconds for a man she'd never met, yet felt bound to save by the deepest instinct she possessed. She barked orders to an aide, "Start eye full fluids now." They obeyed, uncertain whether they too would face reprisal for defying policy. The trauma bay felt thick with tension. She could almost feel her supervisor's gaze on her back, like a live camera recording each move. But her hands never wavered on the wound. She stood her ground. In Rachel's mind, only two choices existed: save the man or follow the rules. Though she understood the risks of the first, she chose it as if no other path remained. She needed no one to tell her what was right. It had been etched in her heart the first day she donned her white coat. "He'll die if we wait another 10 minutes. The words burst forth, raw and uncalculated. In that moment, any threat from her superior fell away, drowned by the urgency of life hanging in the balance. The charge nurse's clipped voice resumed, pen scratching across the chart. But Rachel heard only one truth. If she let go, Gregory Hale would not see dawn. And so, amid every warning, every threat, and the risk of her own career, Rachel held fast to a stranger's life. With the aid of a colleague, she guided Gregory into Trauma Room 2, each step weighted by the gravity of her choice. Nobody spoke. The team knew she was breaching protocol, yet they all saw what Rachel saw: a man bleeding out. Once he lay on the table, Rachel reapplied the gauze with renewed force. Blood coated her gloves, warmth seeping through. And still she met those pleading eyes she would never forget, not because they showed fear, but because they held unwavering trust. Behind her, the charge nurse's voice continued, but Rachel no longer registered the words. She heard only one imperative: hold on. And there, amid every ounce of pressure and threat, Rachel Monroe stood firm, fighting for the life of a man she had never met. She did not think of tomorrow. She did not think of herself. She thought only of the sacred duty that had guided her for 12 years, to keep human beings from slipping into the void. And Rachel knew, come what may, this night's choice would remain a decision she never regretted. Rachel had no idea that while she quietly awaited the hospital board's decision, a wave was building silently beyond the trauma bay. Gregory Hale had survived surgery, his severed artery expertly repaired. He remained weak, yet stable, his breathing even, his pulse steady. Life, once a fragile thread at his arrival, had been reconnected. Gregory awoke hours later, bleary from anesthesia, yet fully aware. He remembered the woman kneeling beside him, pressing gauze to his wound, her eyes never leaving his bleeding arm, an act few would dare, few would risk everything to perform for a stranger. He did not know her name, but his gratitude ran deeper than words could convey. His son, First Lieutenant Nathan Hale, received the hospital's call the next morning. Horror struck when he learned of his father's accident, but even more so when the attending physician revealed his father lived only because a nurse had broken protocol. Nathan stood silent. In the military, he understood the value of timely action, defying orders when necessary. He respected souls who did the same. Without hesitation, Nathan shared the story on the military forum he moderated. A brief post concluding, "She saved my father's life, and now she may lose her job for it." What seemed private and small exploded online within hours, across military networks, nursing groups, then local media. They read, they shared, they commented, each with their own reason, but united by outrage and gratitude. Nurses within St. Mary's began whispering. No internal memo was needed. One look at Rachel moving through the halls, eyes downcast, revealed her as the unnamed hero. At first, a few colleagues quietly checked on her. Then small groups formed in the break room, discussing, empathizing. Finally, solidarity peaked when a coalition of nurses drafted a collective letter to management. Do not penalize Rachel. Review the patient care policy. The South Carolina Nurses Association soon intervened, sending representatives to meet hospital leadership. Their petition was polite but firm. When a nurse saves a life through swift action, she deserves commendation, not threat. Local media pounced. A television crew waited for Rachel in the hallway. Under bright lights and microphones, she did not flinch. When asked if she had regrets, she only shook her head. Her face did not seek sympathy but reflected someone certain of her convictions, willing to face the consequences. Online, veterans recorded videos thanking Nurse Rachel. They named her despite never meeting, praising her act as one they longed to perform for their own comrades. An Iraq War amputee declared, "Had that nurse treated me, I'd have healed faster." His words echoed across countless posts, cementing support for Rachel. No one explicitly said it, but it was understood. The hospital's handling of this case, beyond Rachel herself, was under scrutiny. When human compassion is stifled by red tape, a single humane act can spark an awakening. As Rachel prepared to face the board, still in her blood-stained scrubs, a community rallied in her stead. This time, nobody could ignore them. Dear viewers, take a moment to relax or grab a glass of water and stay tuned for the next twist in this story. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always wonderful to see friends from around the world joining us. Comment 1. If this story moved you, so we can continue sharing more powerful tales. The board's verdict came in a frigid conference room where Rachel sat facing impassive faces. They spoke of procedure, of safety, of discipline. She listened without protest, without excuse. She did not need to defend the choice she had made. But when the final words echoed, suspended for 30 days pending review of conduct, something inside her twisted. Not because she'd lose her job, because she knew the silence that would follow. The silence of a system all too accustomed to punishing courage. She rose, nodded quietly, and left the room as one braced for the worst. But she had no idea that, just steps beyond that door, something awaited her, something even her punishers could never have anticipated. The hospital lobby, usually alive with footsteps, paging machines, and whispered worries, was unnaturally still. For over 30 Marines in dress uniform stood in 2 neat lines flanking the entrance. No chants, no banners. They simply stood, shoulders square, eyes fixed on the door Rachel would emerge from, a silent barrier more powerful than any declaration. When Rachel stepped out, she froze. She didn't understand. In that stunned moment, she locked eyes with a familiar face. Nathan Hale, Gregory's son, standing at the head of the uniformed ranks. He spoke no words at first. He only looked at her, then offered a gentle nod. A reporter among the crowd wept. A nearby nurse covered her mouth, choking back emotion. Rachel didn't know how to react. She'd never imagined this. She had only done what she believed right. But now, that act had touched more hearts than she ever knew. Nathan took a step forward, then spoke, his voice low but clear. He offered no defense, no attack, only simple truths. That his father lived because of this woman, that she did what was right when everyone else stood silent, and that they, veterans who understood the value of timely action, could not remain away. No applause followed. None was needed. Their presence was the highest honor, affirmation of the courage Rachel had displayed. That silence rang louder than any shout. Rachel did not cry, but her eyes glistened. She did not bow her head, nor did she stand proud. She simply looked at each face, and for the first time in years, knew she was not alone. Her actions were not buried in bureaucracy. They had been witnessed, acknowledged, and now protected. The Marines said nothing more. They stood thus for a few minutes. Then, one by one, without command, they quietly turned and left. No one lingered. No one made noise. They came as a silent oath that certain values must never be punished. From upstairs, the hospital board watched through glass. They said nothing. Yet their expressions had shifted. They had not merely witnessed a protest. They had witnessed a community, strong, united, and rightly indignant. Rachel walked slowly to the far end of the lobby where her fellow nurses waited. No words were needed, for in each heart something had been rekindled. Faith in the profession they had chosen, and in the woman who reminded them that medical ethics are not a line item on a form, but something they must dare to uphold, no matter the cost. The events at St. Mary's Memorial were no longer an internal matter. They had become a media epicenter. National news outlets carried continuous updates. Images of Rachel standing amid Marines spread like wildfire. Some major papers hailed her as the guardian of nursing ethics, while others dubbed her a symbol of courage in a heartless bureaucracy. Soon, clinics and hospitals across the state felt a domino effect. Patients learned of Rachel's suspension and canceled appointments, even refusing admission unless a trusted nurse vouched for their care. Such small acts, when multiplied, created an undeniable swell of protest. At St. Mary's, patient returns plummeted. Nurses began openly voicing discontent. Some penned open letters to leadership. Others shared personal stories of helplessness under rigid policies. Each story added a piece to a larger picture, a system in desperate need of reform. The board could no longer remain silent. An emergency meeting was convened, this time with representatives from the State Nurses Association, veterans groups, and legal advisors present. The tension in the hall was palpable, but so was hope that this time they would truly listen. Board chair. Dr. Lorraine Whitaker spoke first. She knew the battlefield well, having served as a combat surgeon in Iraq for 2 years. That experience made it impossible for her to ignore what had happened. She understood what it meant to act when there was no time for paperwork. Standing before everyone, she scanned the room before speaking, not in the language of an administrator, but of someone who had stood on the front lines. "We were wrong," she said, her voice low but firm. "Wrong to let regulations overwhelm our compassion. Nurse Monroe's actions remind us that ethics must lead. We cannot call ourselves healthcare professionals if we forget why we entered this field in the first place: to save lives." No one spoke, but in every pair of eyes there was agreement. Her words were not pandering to public opinion, they were a genuine awakening. Rachel was invited to return to the hospital that very day. No further hearings, no pledges to sign. She was fully reinstated with all honors and benefits restored. But more surprising was the special invitation to join the committee rewriting emergency treatment policies for the entire system. She did not answer immediately. She needed time, not to ponder glory, but to consider whether she was ready for a new battle, one no longer in the ER, but in conference rooms where every line of policy could mean life or death. In the end, she accepted, for she knew, if not her, who would dare ask the first question? Who else would say, "I saved a life and risked my career for it"? Rachel returned to the place that had once wounded her, not for vengeance, but to make amends. She walked the familiar corridors, passing old colleagues. Some nodded, others smiled. A few remained silent, but their gazes were no longer cold. She could feel change in the air, subtle but real. When her hand touched the doorknob of her old office, a strange sensation stirred in her chest. Not fear, nor pride, but a quiet acknowledgement. She had chosen the right path, even if it began with blood on her white coat sleeve. And now, she was no longer just a nurse. She was the spark that reignited a system that had long grown cold. The story at St. Mary's Memorial did not end with Rachel's reinstatement. In fact, it was only the beginning of a new journey. An entirely different chapter, in which she no longer stood alone in the ER, but at the center of a transforming system. Monroe Protocol, the new policy prioritizing treatment for critical patients without waiting for paperwork, was adopted not only at St. Mary's Memorial, but rolled out to over 40 hospitals nationwide within 6 months. An unprecedented action, sparked by a single decisive, humane act from a nurse who once nearly lost her job for doing what was right. Rachel was invited to the policy's unveiling in Washington, D.C., where she received an honorary citation from the Departments of Health and the U.S. military. When handed the award, she simply bowed her head, offering no long speech, only a soft phrase, "This is not my honor alone." As camera lights flashed, she looked down at her hands once stained with a stranger's blood, now symbols of change. Gregory Hale recovered well. Though he walked more slowly after the ordeal, his eyes shone brighter. He began speaking at veterans gatherings, medical school events, even national conferences, not about his accident, but about a nurse. A single action, and the lesson that health care without compassion is just a heartless machine. On the 1-year anniversary, the hospital held a modest but solemn ceremony. They renamed the ER, where it all began, the Gregory Hale Emergency Wing. Not because he was a victim, but because he was a living witness to the true value of a human-centered decision amid a tangle of rules. Rachel stood in the familiar hallway, flanked by young nurses, some fresh out of school, some only months into the job. They looked at her as a symbol, but she did not want that. She only wanted them to remember one thing, just as she reminded them at the renaming ceremony. Every decision to save a life is a pledge to our humanity, and no procedure should ever stand in its way. That sentence now hangs in every trauma room briefing area, not as a slogan, but as a reminder. Never forget why you chose this profession. Rachel's life did not change. She still arrived on time. She still disliked cameras and long speeches. But those who worked beside her knew. They served alongside someone who had once chosen right when everything else said no. They looked to her as their compass through shifts where the line between life, death, paperwork, policy is frighteningly thin. And if this story has touched millions, it is because one undeniable truth remains. We all want to be saved at the right moment. We all need people like Rachel in our lives, people who dare to stand up, not for applause, but because they cannot turn their backs on another human in need. The greatest lesson did not come from hospital corridors, but from the quiet choice of a woman who did not wait for permission to do what was right. She did not fight the system. She reminded it of its purpose. Thank you for staying with us through this journey. If Rachel's story moved you, please share it with your loved ones, especially in the United States, where so many nurses, doctors, and patients still struggle between paperwork and lives on the line. Don't forget to subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments, and let us know where and when you're watching. We'd love to hear how Rachel's courage resonates with you, because sometimes a small story can change the way an entire system sees compassion.